This week on D&D Rule Solution, I'm starting with flaws, ideals, bonds, and self in character creation. So as we go through building our characters, last week we talked about my approach to, starting with background, then going into class, then going into race, then into class, and then into your ability scores actually last. It's kind of like an upside down cake of character creation, if you will. This week I'm talking about how to flesh out the narrative elements of your character, specifically flaws, ideals, bonds, and self. Now, I find that there are typically two types of players: the ones who really lean into this to flesh out narrative backstory, and the ones who kind of overlook it one way or another. But here's a way I think to find middle ground there. What I always ask my players when you talk about your flaws, ideals, bonds, and your sense of self, ask yourself, who are you? What do you value? From there, what are some of your pet peeves? What are the things that really irritate you? And what excites you? What gets you fired up? Is there a specific topic or concept as a character that you love or hate to get involved with? And who do you like to be around? So think about the social culture that rounds out a person and a player and who they are. And a lot of times I think you'll find this reflects almost directly the players who are controlling those characters. And that's perfectly fine too. I think it's important not to overlook this because it is a really important mechanic to attach a player to the characters, and from there you're going to get a much better sense of play, much better investment into the story and things like that. So some other things to consider when you're thinking about your bond self, without calling them flaws or bonds or ideals like we see them on the character sheet. Just think about them as narrative color. So, what really grinds your gears? What are the types of things that just piss your character right the hell off? How does your upbringing define your existence in a new world or your worldview of things? How has your experience as a child or as a teenager, adolescent, or beyond really affected how you view the world and the people around you? What room in your character, equally important, is there to be influenced around this? Or how much room do you as a character have to grow into or out of this? And this helps really lay the bricks for team dynamics, team play, because you're forcing your players to think about the nuances of how their characters value certain things. And from that, you can address anything that comes up the table afterwards, like how they interact with the team or how they factor into a party or what some of the things that they might value or devalue are, so that everyone's aware of what that character sits, where they sit, and how they might react to those types of things. Not only does it help adhere them to the story and invest them in character, but also might help you get ahead of or get a sneak preview of some of the challenges that might come up as that player plays that character. And that's pretty invaluable as a DM. Second up on Rule Solution, I'm talking about getting tactical. We're looking at equipment and starting gear for your character once you've fleshed out all these wonderful diversity and various options to make your character uniquely you. Let's get into the shopping of it. So before we get to the specifics of how these are defined, I like to look ahead into the character creation process. And this is the order I use to define equipment, starting equipment and gold and things like that for characters. First of all, as a house rule, I give max gold and starting equipment to my characters. That's a little polarizing, so stay with me on it, because then after this is done, I let them shop. But by shop, I mean we might role play it a little bit, but this is really before they even step out of the gate into adventure. So I give max gold for the class and starting equipment. I tell them to take their background gold and any equipment that's given by their background. Then I determine the max gold for their class and give them that. And then we go into the class where they choose their class equipment. So this ensures that you don't have any duplication from your backstory or your background where those items are hard baked in. So they choose their class equipment according to whatever class they like, and I don't use encumbrance. As I said, I think it's a really clunky, ill-thought-out system in D&D 5e, so the encumbrance I use is common sense. Like I said, you can't carry an armory on your back, and you can't lug 10,000 gold coins around, so just the encumbrance or the economy of common sense there. So for example, here's how that would act for a fighter, let's say, who chose the soldier background. The soldier background is going to give you an insignia, a trophy from an enemy like a bone or a broken dagger, bone dice or cards, and 10 gold pieces. So boom, you're a soldier, you get it. You're a fighter, so you get to choose chain or leather. You get your selection of either bow and arrows or and bow and arrows. You get to choose either a weapon and shield or two primary weapons, and you get your choice of either a crossbow or hand axes. Then you get to choose either Dungeoneer's pack or Explorer's pack. So boom, you make your choices, you get that. In addition to that, then you get your max gold, and then we shop. So I take you into the equipment lists. I give you access to all the armor, the general armor, all the general weapons, all the general items that are available in the player's handbook. But from there, you have to use your starting gold to spend on those things. And what that does is it gives a character a really nice setup to start the world with. And they can either keep that gold to themselves to use in the adventure, or they can buy things like maybe a couple of health potions to start out, or maybe they want some extra candles, I don't know, some parchment. Maybe they want to change the armor that they selected. They got chainmail as a fighter. Maybe they want to buy splint mail. Fine, but you got to buy it. So that also prevents them from doing something stupid like walking out at level 1 with full plate mail, because they can't buy it from the 200 max gold that fighters get. And that's basically how I line up equipment to start an adventure. Remember, proficiency does not equal gear. So if you are proficient with thieves' tools, let's say, it doesn't mean you automatically have thieves' tools. So unless it says that in one of your equipment set, you might have to go in the equipment menu and buy that with that sweet max gold that I've given you on creation. Next up, I'm going into determining armor class and defining your ability modifiers and how they apply to armor class. Every character, as we know, starts with base armor class of 10, and then you work through your armor type. So as you're doing this, I always encourage players to be mindful of the effects that armor has, particularly on your dexterity mod and your stealth checks. After light armor in the equipment list, dexterity grants only a maximum of +2 to your armor class, regardless of what your dex mod is. So if you've pumped up your dex to a +4 mod, if you go a little too heavy on the armor, you're going to start to negate that benefit. Additionally, beyond medium armor, you're also going to start to incur disadvantage on your stealth checks. It's important to be mindful of that, because many armor types in the list do levy disadvantage on your stealth checks. So keep an eye on that, especially for your players. Not only that, but beyond medium, when you get into heavy armor, most heavy armors also have strength requirements too. It's important to not discount those, because that's going to do things like keep rogues in balance, so you don't have rogues running around with like plate mail, or you don't have plate mail clad wizards throwing like fireball tanks into the field, which are going to be tricky for you to deal with as a DM as well. So you have to be proficient. You have to have the strength requirements to manage that armor, and that's all contributes to the balance at the end of the day. Second to last, we're jumping into weapons. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically about weapons in this segment of Rule Solution. And you want to be mindful particularly of what qualifies as simple and what qualifies as martial weapons. Something simple as a longsword, I think even a short sword qualifies as a martial weapon. So if your class says that you're only proficient in simple weapons, you might not be able to use a short sword. So be mindful of that too. And keep an eye on particularly specific proficiencies that are granted by your class and your race. So the example I used earlier, which I really like for this, is High Elves, for example. High Elves, by their race, are proficient in longsword and longbow, which is different for a lot of other classes and certainly can override what you're able to use in a class. Which means, for example, if you're a High Elf wizard, wizards aren't proficient in martial weapons, but a High Elf wizard would be able to use a longsword. So it might give you a little bit of an advantage when you're building out that character as well. So keep those in mind. Some specific distinctions around weapons to keep in mind is melee versus range. So whether something is a melee or ranged weapon, or an item that can be used either way. Melee weapons are either dexterity or strength based, or can be both depending on their property. Ranged are dexterity based weapons, with the exception of thrown melee weapons like daggers, which can use dex or strength, and hand axes, javelins, small hammers, and spears that use strength when thrown. So make sure not to overlook those nuances as well. Now, these abilities can and will be modified by properties of the weapons themselves. We'll talk about that in the next section. But range also has two numbers, you'll see. The first range is the ideal distance, or the normal use distance. The second number is the distance you can use that weapon at disadvantage, and no ranged weapon can be thrown beyond that max range. Finally, on D&D Rule Solution, I'm talking specifically about the weapon properties. So these are the little italicized items that you see under weapon entry in the weapon list. And there are 11 core weapon properties in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. They are ammunition, which means it requires ammo to use. Finesse, which means with that weapon, you can either use strength or dexterity as your modifier. Heavy, which means small creatures have disadvantage using those types of weapons. Light, which means that weapon can be used as a dual weapon or in a dual weapon setup. Loading means that that weapon can be fired once per action, but then needs to be reloaded. And what that means is if you use that weapon once during an action, bonus, or reaction, regardless of the amount of attacks you have, you cannot use that weapon again. So if you're a fighter with 2 weapon attacks in a round, you can't shoot a weapon twice that has the loading property. You have to shoot it once and then either use an action to reload it or use another attack. Range, of course, just suggests that that weapon can be used for ranged attacks, so that's important where you have something like a hand axe that can be used as melee or thrown. And reach property, which means it adds 5 feet to the melee range, which means you can attack 2 blocks out of your circle. Special follows special weapons guidelines, which are handled elsewhere in the player's handbook. We'll cover those in another segment. Thrown, which means this is a melee attack that can be thrown and uses the same stats as a melee attack when thrown. In that fashion. Two-handed, of course, means that the weapon requires 2 hands to use. And versatile, which means that you can either use the weapon one-handed or two-handed, and it enjoys an attack or damage bonus when used two-handed, like a longsword or a spear. Finally, just to round that out, there are improvised weapons too, which are not to be forgotten. So if you grab a table leg and you beat someone over the head with it, or you smash a door into something, I don't know, I'm about using furniture to hurt people today. The proficiency bonus for that is discretionary. So as a DM, if you grab like a lantern and you throw it at somebody, I'd say you're probably not proficient in that. It's an improvised weapon. But if you grab a table leg and you're proficient with club, then I might say, that's close enough. You'll get your proficiency bonus because it's basically a club now. So it's discretionary there. However, improvised weapons always deal 1d4 damage. So it doesn't matter what they are. If they're not an official weapon, then it's improvised, which means it deals 1d4 damage. And if it's thrown, we use the range guide of 20 feet normal range and 60 feet max range. And that's how you handle weapons and improvised weapons at the table.